Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Probably Cancelled podcast in association with the Midwestern Marx Institute. Today, I am joined by Ted Reese, tuning in all the way from England. Ted is a British Marxist writer and thinker who is deeply influenced by the work of economist Henryk Grossman. Reese's scholarship focused on analyzing the dynamics of capitalist systems, particularly through the lens of Grossman's theories on capital accumulation and systemic breakdown. He has authored several books, including Socialism or Extinction, Climate, Automation, and the War in the Final Capitalist Breakdown, Abundant Material Wealth for All, and The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman. In his writing, Reese examines contemporary empirical data to support Marxist theories of capitalist breakdown and advocates for socialism as a necessary response to challenges like automation and climate change. So I'm really happy to have you here, Ted. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming. This is a really interesting subject, and a lot of your work is really in depth. And if you're like me, I'm not the most economically knowledgeable person. So today we're going to do this episode for it's kind of like a explain to me like I'm five version of your work. Like a
I'll try.
really rudimentary. Yeah. Yeah, and even that is difficult because these are really complex subjects. So maybe not
I,
explain like I'm five, but explain like I'm
yeah,
25 or something.
I mean, I try and
Um,
keep it simple anyway, but yeah, I'll go. I'll
yeah,
for
it's gonna be
simple.
great. Yeah, thank you. Because people like me, I need a little bit of extra help. So just to get started, for people who are not familiar with your work, can you just give us a brief introduction to your theoretical approach and what you do?
Yeah. So as you say, I'm influenced by Henryk Grossman, who was a Polish Jewish Marxist who wrote a book called The Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System in 1929. It was published just before the Wall Street crash, when everyone else was saying that capitalism was in rude health. He turned out to be right in his predictions that it was about to undergo a massive breakdown. And basically, he's just the best defender of Marx that I've found and the theories of that Marx lays out in Capital. And he draws out this breakdown theory from Marx's work, where he basically produces sort of simplified, pure versions of capital accumulation in like mathematical schemas or patterns, and he just follows them through to see where they go. To it allocates where the profit needs to go in terms of towards wages, towards profit, towards the consumption of capitalists, which is of course the incentive for being a capitalist. Um, Postulates a rate of profit and accumulation, and then follows it through. And basically, all that it shows is that capital at some point during the cycle of accumulation breaks down because there's a lack of or a shortage of value or surplus value that's being extracted from the working class that can then be converted into profit and capital. So at that point, a recession becomes inevitable. So all he's really showing is that recessions are inevitable in capitalism because you get this surplus of capital that just cannot be invested. It can't be profitably invested. It can't yield a profit sufficiently. So there's no point in investing it. So what I do is what I've been doing is saying, well, okay, this makes a lot of sense considering how many recessions and big recessions I've experienced in my lifetime. And does it, correlate with empirical data, and does it correlate with Marx's other, um, you know, sort of findings that socialism has to eventually replace capitalism? And if you look at the empirical data, I think obviously the big one that most people um, on the left know about is the falling rate of profit. And it doesn't just tend to fall, it tends to fall historically towards zero. So I think even if you can just grasp that, then you're halfway there, because it becomes pretty obvious that the closer we get to zero, the harder it is for capitalism to function.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it's a historical trend is obviously makes it very clear that it's, can't last forever. The other main empirical facts or data that I've found that I think really back this up are the fact that more than half of the banks, because what happens is, in response to a crisis, you get a lot of obviously bankruptcies, and then you get mergers and acquisitions. So what capitalists do is they join forces to a certain extent to economize production, make it cheaper, achieve economies of scale. They can produce more commodities in less time, and therefore offset the rate of profit falling for a while by increasing the overall massive profit. So what happens is you essentially end up with fewer capitalists relative to the total amount of capital. So you get a centralization of wealth and capital. So what we see looking at this empirical data is that the number of banks in the US has more than halved just in the last 20 odd years. The same is true for the number of publicly listed companies. That's privately owned companies, but they're publicly listed on the stock exchange, so anyone can invest in them if they've got a bit of spare money. And the other thing is the largest or richest 500 companies on the S&P 500 stock exchange, the average lifespan has fallen from 60 years in the 1960s to around 15 years today, and that might actually be lower now, because that stat is from about 10 years ago, and I haven't found an update on that yet. So again, we see this sort of historical trajectory towards ever greater integration of production through ever greater mergers and acquisitions. And the way I formulated this is to say that, quite simply, we're heading historically towards what I call a final merger, where,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, if that tendency continues, and there's nothing to suggest it won't, then we're heading towards a final merger that is historically and economically necessary. And the the thing about it that makes it all the more compelling is that it's happening at an accelerating rate. So almost the entirety of the merger and acquisition waves in the US have happened in the last 35 years. So yeah, I just basically marry the Marxist theory with the empirical data, see if they're matching up, and they are. And the implication is of a final merger is that it has to be publicly owned, because in a
Mm-hmm.
total monopoly, there's no exchange of ownership, which makes capital and money historically obsolete.
Okay, so just to clarify, when you say that it's economically necessary, are you saying that, as these mergers happen and the capital accumulation becomes like solidified and in smaller hands, essentially, that over time, with the development of socialism, that it will be easier for these entities to become nationalized or made public? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying, or am I getting it
I
wrong?
think when I say the final when I say there has to be a final merger, that has to be carried out by a socialist state. Like, the capitalists
Right.
aren't going to expropriate themselves. A capitalist state can't end capitalism by definition, because it wouldn't be a capitalist state if it was doing that. So, but the closer we get to a scenario where there are so few private companies left and capitalists left, because the other implication of this is that the capitalist class is dying out. It's a
Mm-hmm.
relatively dwindling class. The implication is that as capital concentrates into fewer and fewer hands in terms of who owns capital, the rest of the population is then excluded from owning capital, is proletarianized, is forced to work for a wage and an ever lower wage, given that profit rates are so low that capitalists need to attack wages in order to counter this tendency, that instigates or intensifies the class struggle, whereby
Hmm.
eventually this concentration of capital will see the capitalist class essentially bite off more than it can chew, and that will compel a working class movement to replace capitalism and the capitalist state with a socialist state that then progressively takes more and more of the economy under public ownership at whatever pace
Right.
that is possible, or depending on the circumstances that we inherit when it happens.
Right. Okay. So whereas a lot of Marxists, like Western Marxists, will see, we all know that this is happening. We can see it. You're
Mm,
referring to actual data, but we can also just see this is the truth of what's been happening
yeah.
for decades and decades. And many Marxists, at least in the West, would see this and have a doomsday type prophecy about it. And I is what you're saying that this is kind of a natural progression, that this is just the nature of how things are going to cycle until we reach a new stage of socialism, that it's a neutral natural progression that is necessary for our ultimate goals. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, Marx did see it as a natural. He saw socialism's supersession superseding of capitalism as a natural historical process. Emphasize
Right.
on the word process because it's not it's obviously not a sudden jump or something like that. Um, but it basically it's absolutely bound up with the needs of capital accumulation. So the rate of profit falls. They have to counter that by economizing productivity. So they merge their companies more and more and more, and you get to the point where there's no more mergers left to have other than to merge everything together completely in
Right.
terms
Yeah.
of a total ownership of production and the economy. So that's not to say that we can just sit back and watch it happen. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. And Henryk Grossman never said that, and obviously Marx never said it. But it compels us. It compels us to see it through, because the alternative is barbarism and endless poverty. So I can't tell you when this is going to happen, how long it's going to take, how long it's going to take for the capitalist class to sort of dwindle down to almost nothing, or for the working class to be such an overwhelming factor that it becomes impossible to resist the demands of the working class, or however exactly it's going to pan out, and why exactly, and who exactly, what part of the working class is going to lead it, or whatever. But this has to happen for productive innovation and progress to continue progressing, because there is a social necessity as well as an economic necessity, which is that humans innovate. Like that's in our nature. We we've always innovated. Whatever mode of production we've lived under in the past, we've innovated, and that has led to other new economic and social horizons and modes of production. So it's sort of they're both complementing each other and inseparable. The social and economic, they're both inseparable and complementing each other, and it's those two things sort of interacting as in a holistic way that is going to compel this to happen. And yeah, it is an organic, historic, natural process, but as I say, we're the ones who are going to have to carry it through ultimately.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense to me because I can just literally see it happening.
Mm.
And it kind of reminds me of the singularity theory that people talk about in kind of more of the tech world. This is like the
Yeah.
economic version of it almost. And I don't know if I believe in the technological one, but what you're proposing makes total sense to me and actually makes me feel a bit optimistic in a way, or
Yeah,
it gives
that's
me
the thing.
some
Like,
sense of
yeah,
optimism. Yeah.
that's the thing. Like, it's all very well and good saying, it's because a lot of the criticism of Grossman is that he underestimates the role of the working class and the class struggle. And I think that side of the argument gets overestimated a bit, because if there wasn't this sort of economic compulsion or imperative, then I have to ask, why hasn't it happened yet? Why hasn't the working class overthrown capitalism on a world? Obviously, there have been socialist working class revolutions in the past, but it hasn't happened on a worldwide basis yet. And in fact, the working class and communist movements have suffered massive setbacks that we still haven't recovered from. Yet, despite that, this economic trajectory continues unabated. So
Hmm.
you have to ask the question, and a lot of people say, well, what they also say, sorry, there's just something come up on my screen. They also say, where is this class struggle? Because, a lot of the last 40 years, there hasn't been a lot of striking going on compared to, like, in Britain and the US in particular. There hasn't been a lot of strikes compared to in the 70s and early 80s. So, but despite those two things, despite the sort of like the lack of class struggle on the part of the working class in recent times, and despite the sort of overestimation of the class struggle, this this economic tendency is just overwhelming, because we can see these corporations just becoming ever bigger and more powerful, and it's just obviously unsustainable. So you either get the question of, well, break up the monopolies, which a lot of people think is what needs to happen, but that's where the importance of understanding the theory comes in, because it's going to be a lot easier for the working class to overthrow the capitalist class if they actually understand why what's happening is happening. And that's where I think
Right.
a vanguard communist party is essential, to try and get as many people as possible to understand it. I'm not saying everyone has to understand it, or that everyone needs to understand it very precisely and immaculately, but a fairly strong grasp of these historical tendencies, which is absolutely a lot easier to grasp if you have the empirical data of what's actually happening in the real world backing it up. I think,
Hmm.
it can be a very convincing and compelling way of selling the argument.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of people would have a short term view and would say things like, oh, we need to break up the monopolies, which is a great sentiment. Like I totally
Yeah.
understand the sentiment,
Mm.
but in the materialist view, it's a very long term point of view. It's a very far reaching point of view where we're looking into the future. Where something like Amazon, if we were eventually able to nationalize Amazon, that would be a great tool for the people.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't really think of it like that. What are your thoughts on that in particular? Would you be for that?
For nationalizing Amazon, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Any yeah, like I would say, like, the big corporations that have the most sort of influence on the day-to-day running of the economy are the ones that need to be nationalized, taken under public ownership first. So
Hmm.
your energy, your water, your postal service, um, your big monopolies, and anything that's essential to the running of the economy and the living standards of everyday people, who, they need their energy, they need their electricity, they need their water. And even small businesses really should be, a lot of the time they're not, unfortunately, but they should really be in favor of nationalizing the big corporations and the utilities, because even in that first early stage of socialism, we're probably not going to nationalize all of the smaller companies, and the smaller companies are actually going to benefit Like even without a socialist revolution or whoever's in charge of the state, small businesses would actually benefit from having energy nationalized because it would cheapen energy,
Right.
which would
Right.
make their bills go down like significantly. But unfortunately,
Yeah.
small business people tend to think that we're already in socialism now, or that we need to break up the monopolies. So it's quite hard to get through to them, unfortunately, a lot of the time. Not all of the time, but a lot of
Yeah.
the time. Just because of what they're accustomed to, you know.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So you have already touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to ask you if you wanted to expand on how your work fits into the broader Marxist tradition historically.
Okay, so my work, I mean, really the chief aim of it is to get this over accumulation theory and this crisis theory or breakdown theory, whatever you want to call it exactly. My aim is to get it at the forefront of Marxist educational programs. So I think communist parties need to be adopting this as their sort of at the forefront of their analysis and their educational programs, and to also be pushing this empirical data that backs it up to the forefront of their agitation. The communist parties in the past have really focused on overproduction as they've really highlighted overproduction of commodities as the cause of the key manifestation of crisis, which the theory is kind of similar. Like they see that the ratio of capital tends to rise relative to the ratio of labor in order to raise the productivity of labor and produce more profit more quickly. But the focus then is skewed towards the overproduction of commodities, which I think leaves wriggle room for reformist um, reformist responses to the crisis. Because if the problem is an overproduction of commodities, then the solution is just to reduce the number of commodities and make sure they're being allocated in the correct proportions by a sort of socially democratic run regulated state. And I think that sows illusions in what's possible at the point in time that we are, because obviously social democracy had some success in the past, but in very particular conditions when capitalism wasn't suffering from such a large overaccumulation of capital as it is now. Um, so I think it's really important to get Grossman's work at the forefront of our education and agitation. Even if we're not using his name, I'm not trying to um, lionize him or sort of create some sort of cult figure or anything. But I just think in particular his actual work, because it's so clarifying, and like for me, reading his book was easier than reading Capital, because obviously Marx's Capital is very dense. It's 3 volumes. Grossman's book is quite long. It's about 600 pages, but it's very easy to read. Like his writing style is very accessible, quite entertaining as well. And it's one book, it's 1 volume, and it just focuses mainly on crisis theory, which is what we have to deal with. That's what's in front of us, is the crisis. So, that trumps everything else in terms of our understanding. And I think if we can just get that right in terms of what we're saying, in terms of why capitalism is failing, we can just clarify things and make things easier to people, and also counter those arguments that are going to come our way. Because like I say, if we focus on overproduction theory, then the arguments against that, the reformist arguments against that, actually start to make some sense. So we need to be able to counter the reformist arguments, because I don't want to sow any illusions. Like the reality is that capitalism has got to go, and that for us to have decent living standards, we're gonna have to have socialism.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of Grossman until I came across your work.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just me or what, but has his work been intentionally buried? What's the story here with him?
Yeah, so it's been up and down. Like he was exiled. He was in the Revolutionary Communist Party first in Poland, and he was exiled to Germany.
What year
And
was this? Or
um,
about?
in the 30s,
Okay.
yeah, early 30s.
Okay.
And then no, sorry, might have been after. I've forgotten, honestly. I forgot. It might have been after World War One or during World War One. But he was exiled
Okay.
from Poland for his revolutionary activity with the Communist Party. He supported Lenin. He continued to support. He had criticisms of Stalin, but he continued to support Stalin and the Soviet Union throughout its existence while he was alive. He was exiled to Germany and he joined the Frankfurt School because he was allowed to remain in Germany on the condition that he didn't join the German Communist Party. So he joined the Frankfurt School and he wrote his book. And it was actually, I don't know if it was like the most popular book that the Frankfurt School published of all time, but at the time, certainly, it was the most read publication that the Frankfurt School had produced, which was quite an achievement because the Frankfurt School kind of um, focused more on cultural Marxist analysis
Hmm.
um, and ideological analysis. So obviously he publishes the book like months before the Wall Street crash, and he's saying there's going to be a massive crash in America, it's going to ruin Europe. Um, and like a year before this, Karl Kautsky, who was a former leader of the revolutionary wing of European Marxism, but had turned to the reformist wing, was saying like we've had a world war and capitalism has survived. Capitalism's stronger than ever. A year later, you get the Wall Street crash, which Grossman had been saying this is going to happen, and all he had to do to recognise it was going to happen was look at the stock market and see that like this wildly inflated Ponzi scheme was fit to burst. But others looked at the soaring sort of increase in value of the stock market as a sign of economic strength, which people still make that mistake today. And so, but he got enormous flack from all wings of the movement. Like the reformist wing obviously denounced it because they wanted a reformist path to socialism, which was contradicted their theory, because their theory actually promoted this idea that capitalism could go on forever, that capital could accumulate harmoniously and indefinitely as long as the state was regulating it properly. So this justified social democracy. And unfortunately, the Soviet Union didn't didn't promote Grossman's work, and Stalin's chief economic advisor Eugen Varga basically had a pretty similar economic theory or crisis theory to Rosa Luxemburg, which wasn't the biggest problem in the world because it was still a breakdown theory, but it kind of located the the point of crisis at the level of consumption rather than at the point of production. Whereas as Marxists, we should really be able to point to everything comes down to like everything's like needs to be analyzed holistic, but at the end of the day, we do need to come back to the point of production and the
Hmm.
inherent sort of like internal contradictions of capitalism at the point of production. Because you sort of if you locate the crisis at the point of consumption, then you can basically come up with false solutions as a result. That's the danger. So that's why I think it's so important to get this right. And yeah, so unfortunately, the Soviet Union didn't really back Grossman up. He did get some credit within the socialist bloc because he moved to East Germany and lectured there after the Second World War. So he got a bit of recognition there. And then when he died in the 50s, his work was kind of forgotten. And then in the 70s, when capitalism entered a big crisis again, there was a handful of Marxists who started to research his work and republish it. And there was, but even then, it was just essays, and there wasn't a abridged version of his book published until 1992, which um, didn't include the last chapter, which was the chapter all about class struggle and what generates it and what intensifies it and why it's so important and what it results in. So that's partly responsible for why he gets attacked for underestimating the importance of class struggle. It, three years ago, a full English translation of his work came out. Uh, I'm not sure how expensive the book is, or if it's in paperback yet. The hardback was expensive, so it's still quite inaccessible, unless you can find a copy online, of course. And it might, like I say, it might be out in paperback now. But the guy the Rick Kuhn, who translated the book, who's done absolutely brilliant work. But he criticizes Grossman's politics for supporting Stalin. So, like, there's just so many, like, he's attacked from all angles. Even his
Mm-hmm.
supporters can find, like, and like, I'm not saying he was perfect. I think he was a bit harsh on Rosa Luxemburg. Um, I think he was a little bit melodramatic in some of his criticism of the Marxists of the time. Perhaps that was necessary to get noticed or whatever. But it, in the end, his work is very important, and yeah, it's just been neglected. There's a lot of competition, so it's understandable to an extent. But it really is the best defense of capital, and it serves as a really good primer to capital as well. So I really think, like, anyone getting interested in socialism should look this book up. And obviously, my work is a primer to that book as well. So that's an option as well.
Yeah, of course, as usual, I'm going to link all your work in the show notes of this episode so people can get it easily and find you. And man, I'm really glad you're here because this is such an important subject that nobody hardly ever talks about. Um, so I wanted to get your thoughts because obviously the economy in the United States, at least, is in a pretty bad state. With the rate of inflation is super super high, and then we have the Trump administration coming in and trying to do their best to salvage whatever they can and boost the economy back up again. And through all of this, I've been seeing people more and more talking about how, looking at the data, looking at the stock market, we see this bubble, just a huge bubble forming, bigger than the 2008 bubble, is what people are saying, and that a new severe depression is on the horizon. Have you looked at this at all? What are your thoughts on what's coming in the next 5 years? What can you, I mean, you kind of have more or less a crystal ball when you're in the field of study that you're in. What do you see currently?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite a crystal ball, but it obviously gives us an advantage. Unfortunately, it's not quite a crystal ball, but obviously it gives us an advantage. Yeah, the stock market bubble in the US is worse than ever. It's more than 200. The debt to GDP is surpassed 200% for the first time as of, I think, the end of last year. Um, and for the for the first time, people have been labeling it the everything bubble, because obviously we had the housing bubble in 2008, which then spiraled into the financial bubble, which burst in 2008 with the banking crisis. And in 2001, we had the dot-com or tech bubble, which was actually a bigger bubble than the housing crisis, but the the recession was worse in 2008, probably because the government let more companies fail because they needed a, a larger degree of devaluation to get the economy going again, because the crisis is the solution to the crisis. Like, the crisis devalues capital, and then that makes it affordable to purchase again, makes it profitable to invest in again. So this is the crazy thing about this whole system, is it really does need the recession to get going, to kickstart itself again. There are signs that this bubble is going to burst, like in the next year or so. And I'd admit my hands up. I've been saying that for the last 2 years, and it has, like, it did burst to an extent in 2022, but only by about 25%, which doesn't count as a crash, because a crash is usually considered as 30% or more in terms of the overall value of the stock market falling. But obviously that still had massive repercussions in terms of bankruptcies, in terms of attacks on wages, in terms of the inflation that has followed. Um, and yeah, unfortunately, this bubble has to burst at some point, because on the stock market, you have this continual process of the value in the stock market continually concentrating into fewer hands. So it has to burst, because the majority of people investing in the stock market are losing money to the sort of ultra parasitic few at the top. So there's absolutely no way that it can't burst. At some point, the prices will start to fall as more and more people sell their stocks off, and people will panic sell, and the stock market will collapse by at least 30% at some point, but probably by more. And there might be a series of bursts over a few years. So during the Great Depression, it fell by 30% in 1929, but it then fell by another 20% in 1932, I think. And then it never recovered. And I think it fell by 80% by 38 or 1938 or something like that. And then it never recovered. The value of the stock market never recovered until after World War II. So unfortunately, and I hate to be the messenger, it does feel like we're in a scenario, in a Great Depression scenario, um, because there's just so much overaccumulation, and there's so much, like, this is another thing we can look at empirically. Like, debt stands in for the lack of value that's being created in the economy. So the reason the value isn't being created in the economy is, for starters, we're so productive now. We can create things so quickly that there's no value, because if you can make things quicker, more things quicker, they're going to be devalued. Everyone knows that. That's a basic sort of logical rule of economics that no one actually really disputes. And now we can produce so much in so little time that there's not really any real value being created. And this is basically exacerbated by automation, which is basically completing the process. Like, you have fully automated factories more and more now, and it's not just in the developed countries either. It's happening globally. And a fully automated factory doesn't exploit labor. And I don't think we're going to get too much. I don't think we want to get too much into the weeds of value theory, but if capital is not extracting a surplus, if we just summarize value or exchange value simply as gross profit minus the outlay on wages, and you get surplus value, that value sort of passes into the machines and into the commodities, and then is realized as profit at the point of sale or exchange. But with automation, that's not happening. So we come to a point where, again, the sort of viability of capitalism is becoming impossible, and socialism is becoming necessary, because we're basically, if value isn't a thing anymore, if it's not generated anymore, then we don't need money anymore. We need a different system of accounting. And as I say, like, so because this because real value isn't being generated, debt is acting as a substitute. So we're just getting more and more debt, and we're getting more and more over accumulated surplus capital that can't be reinvested. So we can see this on the stock market. We can see this in terms of the debt to GDP, whether it's national debt, corporate debt, they're at record highs. If you look at money market funds where people just stash money because the interest rate is higher, that's higher than not even on the stock market. That's at an all-time high. You've got corporate cash piles at an all-time high. Like go and look up Apple's corporate cash pile. Like they're just sitting on billions of dollars of US dollars that can't be spent. Like they don't know what to do with it. Like so this like you would think, like, if you didn't know all of this, you would see this and you would think, well, don't they want to make more profit? Like the economy runs on the profit incentive. Don't they want to make more profit? Why aren't they investing this money? And then you would also think um, sort of I've lost my trail of thought there, but basically going back to that, there's a profit incentive, but no, sorry, that's what I was going to say. You would also think that with all the privatization that we've had in the last 50 years, that profits would be in a healthier state for more companies, because we've privatized all of the public sector like after World War II in Britain, at least about 30% of the productive economy was state owned or publicly owned, and that's all gone now. We've privatized all of it. So you would think that a capitalist economy would there be healthier because of all that privatization. You'd think the profit rate would be higher. You'd think that we wouldn't need higher taxes because we should be more productive because the privately owned part of the economy has grown. But none of that's happened. We've got way more debt than we had when half the economy was publicly owned. We've got lower wages relative to the profits that are being made. We've got higher inflation. We've got more money printing. Like, this is the thing. People, a lot of the time, people go, "Oh, the crisis is caused by money printing," but look at when the economy was half owned by the public. There wasn't any extortionate money printing back then. Like the money supply was flat. So all of these empirical data points just sort of all add up to the same conclusion and just sort of like hang together very cohesively and coherently, all point in the same direction. So I've rambled on a bit there, but I think you get my drift.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide what direction I want to go with my next question to you, because I almost want to ask you about to clarify your thoughts on automation, AI, and the climate related stuff. Do you want to go into that, or is that
Yeah, of
too
course.
much of a
I
okay?
mean,
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll try and keep it simple. Like the reason capitalists automate production is to raise the productivity of labor and to raise their profits. So get an expansion of commodities, the average commodity is devalued. That leads to an underproduction of value relative to the amount of capital that needs to be reproduced and expanded. So the answer is produce more. So capital gets devalued through the crisis. You can then reinvest profitably. You expand production, but you also innovate production where you can. And actually, expansion tends to happen increasingly through innovation. That's another observable tendency of capitalist development. So with every crisis, we get an acceleration of automation and investment in AI, because two things are happening. You can make and produce commodities quicker, and you can reduce your outlay on wages. So you can get that initial boost to the profit margins just by cutting out the wages that you would have spent on workers and replacing them with robots, because in the long run, the robots are going to be a lot cheaper as an investment. You don't have to spend money on hiring robots. You don't have to give them breaks. You don't have to give them holiday pay, sick pay. They don't even need
Maternity leave.
lighting. They don't even need lighting or heating. So
Yeah.
you can put them underground in cold, dark buildings, and 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 they can run 24/7, and the potential is limitless. But the contradiction is that it's not creating value. So that is the essential thing to grasp. And it is just a historic, unfortunately, like at the core of it, it is just a historical sort of organic progression. Because as I say, we're always going to innovate. We're always going to try and save. We're always going to try and do sort of labor saving innovation. It's just that under capitalism, it's incentivized by the profit motive and the needs of the ever greater needs of capital accumulation, by which I mean it gets harder and harder to accumulate capital. It's a bit like a bodybuilder. Like your early gains are rapid, but then after a while you have to work harder and harder, and but you see diminishing returns. Like your muscles start to grow much more slowly because they've almost sort of got to as big as they can get, sort of thing. So yeah, it's just that this historical tendency, and it's manifesting and culminating in a sort of tendency towards fully automated production. And yeah, every time there's a crisis, they're going to want to increase their investment in automation and AI, even where it's not really sort of practical or wanted. Like, I don't really want an AI doctor. I don't really want I don't really want to have a video call with a computer that is pretending to be a doctor, that is, kind of just sort of regurgitating some sort of pre-formatted. I want to go to a doctor in person and have a sort of intimate conversation and build, trust with that person. But we don't have that with real doctors because they're not granted the time, because they are in this system, unfortunately. They are also working in a factory, which is how hospitals work under capitalism, and they too have to get things done quicker and quicker. And yeah, it just touches everything. And at some point we're kind of like potentially we are going to do a lot of AI that's not really desirable, but that will be because of the needs of capital, because capital will be getting so desperate to sort of cheapen production, and cut its costs, cut its upfront costs. But whereas once we're in a socialist economy, we can sort of pick and choose a bit more. We can say, well, we want automation to do all the labor intensive hard work, and where we want the human touch, where the human touch is really important to us, we'll keep the humans, and it will evolve, and there'll be trial and error, and it won't all go smoothly. I'm not saying socialism is a utopia, or that there won't be political disputes and struggles, and
Mhm.
that different countries won't do it differently to each other. Some countries might want to use AI a lot more than other countries. That's all speculation. But in terms of the general tendency and the needs of capital, this is the way it's going. And in terms of the climate crisis, it just basically comes down to capitalism needs to turn nature into commodities at an ever faster rate. And that means the farms are being sort of exhausted more rapidly. Sorry, I just need to plug my charger in. The farms are being exhausted more rapidly. The trees are being cut down faster. the fossil fuels are being used up quicker. Like, some people think fossil fuel is a renewable source of energy. I don't think it is, but even if it is, it's we're using it up quicker than it can be replenished, by a long way. So in terms of the way we extract it, it's certainly not renewable, the way we have to extract it. And then, like, metal mining is for renewable energy, for wind turbines and solar panels. We're polluting the environment at a more rapid pace just to do that. And yeah, at the point of consumption, solar panels and wind turbines are great, but there are actually other alternatives that we could be utilizing in a socialist mode of production, because labor is the source, the exploitation of labor is the source of profit, and we need to create more and more profit. We actually, as a capitalist system, depend on an ever greater amount of extraction of the environment. So extracting fossil fuels, extracting minerals and metals, chopping down trees. We're ever more dependent on that, and that means that the carbon that is sequestered and buried in the soil and in the trees is being released at an ever faster rate, and it's not being allowed to be reabsorbed by those trees and by the soil either. So it's compounded in that way. And I don't say that climate change is human generated, like liberals and capitalists do. I say it's capitalist generated. It's generated by the needs of capital accumulation. So that's really the nub of it. And like I say, if we had socialism, we wouldn't be so dependent on the labor intensity of production. So we could start weaning out. I'm not saying we could do it quickly, but we could start weaning ourselves off of fossil fuel extraction and metal mining, and we could look at things that already exist, um, like hemp farming. Hemp can be utilized and sort of turned into lots of products. You can make solar panels from trees and plants. You could grow plant. I mean, plants. They get their energy from the sun, right? So they can be used for solar energy. I cover all that in obviously a lot more detail in my book. There's loads of like NASA's been working on microbial fuel cells for decades, nuclear fusion, which China is working on at a much more advanced rate than anyone else.
Yeah.
That will obviously be a big one. But capitalism can't afford to realize the potential of nuclear fusion because it's not profitable.
No. I think that was a really clear answer. Thank you for that. That was nice and clear and concise. Better than I could ever do if I were to be asked that. But I also wanted to talk about, you recently had a viral tweet that you made on Twitter showing how British Premier League football sponsorships have shifted from being almost entirely industrial producer sponsored to financial firms and like gambling companies today. So, what does that tell us about the structure of capital today and your theories in general?
Yeah, so I think it's just this really easy to illustrate example of where things have gone, and basically because we can't produce value through industry anymore, capitalists have had to turn to bleeding the public dry at an ever greater rate, through taxes and rents. Because if you can't generate the value through commodity production and industry, you've got to find that value somewhere else. So effectively, the system has become dependent on redistributing the existing value that has already been generated in the past upwards from the classes from below. So the capitalists at the top, they're dependent on redistributing the value that exists among the middle class capitalists or the middle strata of capitalists. And those capitalists are increasingly dependent on redistributing the value up from small businesses and working class people and working class households. So it's really turning into a very explicit Ponzi scheme, which it's
Mm.
always been, but it's very now kind of like purely, it's become a pure Ponzi scheme, if you like. And it's, a lot of people have tried to characterize this as some sort of neo-feudalism. I just see it as capitalism in decay and sort of, approaching its last legs. So yeah, gambling is, you could sort of characterize gambling as a sort of veiled consumer tax, or but however you characterize it, it's a way of bleeding the public dry, because obviously the poorer people get with their, with through inflation and wage cuts, they're going to turn to gambling. Like, a lot of people are going to turn to gambling because they might win. You might win. There is a chance you might win, and you know some people still think that gambling is like some sort of natural sort of defect or something, but a lot of the time it's sort of a learned habitual problem that has come from the environment. It's been picked up because we've sort of been pushed in that direction or compelled to do it, and obviously the more it's advertised to us, the more sort of it gets stuck in your head, and you start to think about taking a punt. And football can be more enjoyable watching it. If you're a neutral fan, and your teams aren't playing, it can be a bit more exciting to watch it if you've made a bet. So it's
Yeah.
pretty understandable that people end up getting into gambling debt. It is very manipulative and parasitic. But as you say, this tendency with the football shirt sponsors from electronics companies and the like to now finance and gambling, that's what explains it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna put that image of your tweet, the graph, up on the screen so everyone can look at it because it's totally crazy.
Yeah, I
Just
mean,
that I really like that form of illustration too. I thought that was a really creative way to illustrate your point.
yeah, I was surprised that it went viral, because I've posted so many sort of graphics showing like the decaying nature of capitalism in ways that I find more explicit and compelling. But that one is the one that sort of took off and made an impact, which is fair enough. Like that, if that's what people if sort of makes an impact, then that's completely understandable. And people in this country anyway are very invested in their football teams. I am,
Yeah, they are.
so it makes sense.
Yeah, you tapped into the sports world, which is maybe a really good idea actually to try to propagandize our points to like different realms like this, and they can go viral
Yeah, I
if
mean,
you target the right areas.
I have talked about, even like, obviously there are divisions in the working class, like, because everyone's earning a different amount of money. There's all sorts of different sections of the working class, but I've talked about footballers being overworked. Like, they are being overworked. Like,
Yeah.
they're being made to play ever more matches, which is putting their bodies under more and more physical strain.
Hmm.
Um, which means the quality of the spectacle suffers, so the fans suffer as well.
Mm,
And it's
yeah.
it's happening in most sports. Formula One racing, they're doing like 3 times more races now than they were about 25 years ago, because the advertisers and the TV companies are trying to increase the demand. Again, like there's no sort of actual commodity, or there's not an expansion of commodity production there. So
Right.
they're trying to
Yeah.
generate revenue. They're trying to diversify
Right.
revenue streams to make up for the lack of like actual real value that they used to rely
Yeah.
on.
That makes total sense. And then all of the money really goes to the people who own the leagues.
Yeah,
And
and the
I mean,
clubs. Yeah,
hardly anything goes to the actual players. They're kind of like, I don't want to say they're slaves because they're not, but at least in American football, which is like a super, super taxing on the body sport, and
yeah,
you can
exactly.
definitely die from a head injury. It's like you're not really making anything compared to what the coaches are making and the people who own the leagues and the advertisers. Like it's
Yeah, and
crazy to see.
often,
It's always like white people owning it and then putting black people as the players to just like destroy their bodies.
yeah, and also the
Whatever.
players, like sometimes, like the players at the top do make a lot of money, but they've got pressures from their families, like who don't make a lot of money, and they want to buy houses for their parents and their brothers and their sisters and that sort of thing. So the money does go, like it's a lot of the money is spent, and yeah, of course they're not like the few that make it at the professional level are not like pure proletarians or pure working class. They kind of like got a foot in both classes, sort of thing, but they are being overworked. Potentially, they will be re-proletarianized, sort of thing. They'll be pushed back onto sort of total dependence on the wage. You know,
Mhm.
anyone
One
can be
injury and you're done.
yeah.
The dance
I
world is also like that. You have people
yeah.
who train their whole lives to be prima ballerinas and they finally get to do it. And then you have one ankle injury at 20 and then your career is shot and you're just,
Mm.
and they don't even make any money anyway. They're just like for entertainment purposes. And it's all a veneer, you know what I mean? So I think sports is like, can be kind of similar where
Yeah.
they're just completely overworked. And yeah, what a crazy industry. I never really think too deeply about the sports world, but it's funny that your tweet really tapped into that, like a wide group of people through that. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left, so I just wanted to ask you two more questions, essentially. So I'm a member of the American Communist Party, and lately we've been in the process of organizing labor within logistics and transport, particularly with drayage trucking. So, given your views on the importance of automation, AI, and the replacement of labor, do you think that transport and logistics are key battlegrounds in capitalism's terminal crisis? I know you mentioned before that labor organizing has been on a downturn for the last like 50 or more years. We're really trying to revive this tradition that we need. So, I would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, transport workers are productive. They do actually produce value because it's part of the production process. Ultimately, like you're you're being exploited by your employer. Like, so you're producing surplus value. You're adding value to the product, and that means that the product absorbs more value, and that is realized as profit by the employer. So transport workers are definitely productive, and even if they weren't, they're still workers. They still work for a wage, and it would be important to support their struggles. But yeah, they're very important because they can really make capitalists listen. Because if they stop, the economy stops, right? Or a lot of the economy stops, and
Right. The
it's
whole country would stop.
yeah, essentially, and yeah, it's absolutely a key battleground in terms of the automation. And I think the ACP is right to prioritize that struggle because of that for that very reason. Um, in terms of the automation, I don't know if self-driving trucks are ready, and I think they're very very difficult to. It's very very difficult to get them ready because they need
Mhm.
so much data, they need so much trial and error, um, and you would need to basically redo and sort of relay the roads almost completely. I don't know all of the ins and outs of it. Um, and obviously, they might turn to sort of overhead drones, like Amazon's talked to about drones delivering products to the doorstep and that sort of thing. If they try and do that again, like initially, let's say that in response to a mass strike by transport workers, they sack half the workforce and replace them with drones and self-driving cars, if it's possible, just theoretically. Initially, they're going to re-widen their profit margins because they're saving on upfront costs on the wages that they would have used as part of the investment. But in the long run, they're exploiting less labor and therefore generating less profit and further devaluing commodities, which makes them more dependent on the state for bailouts and subsidies, and on generally bleeding the public dry through taxes and rents. And this just deepens all of the crises, all of the contradictions. It deepens the animosity between the working class and the ruling and the capitalist class. So yeah, it's going to be a big part of the struggle, I think, and we have to relate. Yeah, we have to absolutely relate to these struggles and get the working class fighting again. And it will happen with or without parties or vanguard parties, because the working class has got to do it. This is part of the recognition of the theory, is that it's compelled by the economics. Every crisis throws forward new social forces from the working class and the downwardly mobile middle classes and small business people, and even people who maybe had large companies may also fall into the working class and be subjected to all of the crises that capitalism is producing. So yeah, every time these struggles emerge, we absolutely have to relate to them and support them and work with them.
Yeah, we've had really good success so far, which I'm so happy to say that a lot of these truckers are really receptive to us. Even with the name Communist Party, they don't
Yeah,
care. They just want help. They want somebody to help them have a better quality of life because they're being totally robbed of
exactly.
all their labor. It's crazy. It's totally crazy what's happened to them and how much union busting they've been under for many, many decades now. And conversely, we have the rest of the left is very much focused on service industry, labor organizing. I don't know if you've seen in the past few years, there's been a discourse on Twitter about like Starbucks barista organizing, and the debate of whether or not their labor is productive, or if this sector should be the main focus of quote unquote socialist organizing, which it has been. And we also see certain parties within the United States, at least, that are organizing on behalf of federal workers who have been laid off, which I think is like very interesting to see. What are your thoughts on that? How much of a priority should that be taking? Obviously, I think anyone who wants to unionize should be unionizing. Like, if you work at a Starbucks and you want to unionize, I have no opposition to that whatsoever. I do question how productive that is, um, and how it actually aids in the broader class struggle. I would like to get your thoughts on that. So, the floor is
Yeah,
yours.
I mean, I think most services workers are productive, but their productivity is very limited compared to the manufacturing labor in the past, because in the past you had combination of machines and mass factory employment. So you had the factories sort of full of workers who were being exploited and therefore producing labor. And of course, that's changed a lot not completely, but a lot, where the factories are now are not like the sort of traditional factory is now not producing value, which means that employment has shifted massively into the services sector. And obviously, services is a very broad term. I do think, as I say, I do think they're productive because they're still being exploited by capital, but they tend to handle finished or near finished commodities rather
Right.
than, whereas a factory worker is doing the whole assembling of the whole product or producing the raw materials at source. So, and this is one of the reasons capitalism is becoming unsustainable. It's automated away the main value creating part of the economy. But even services workers are under threat from automation, because if I'm a capitalist and my profit margins are low, or my profit rates are low, and I can reduce the outlay on wages by automating my baristas, then I'm going to do it. So I think, like you say, unions for baristas or any other service worker, unionization should be supported. But I think it's right to prioritize something like logistics and transport workers, just because at the moment we have limited resources. You can sort of relate this back to criticism that the Bolsheviks had in Russia, where they were sometimes accused of neglecting the agricultural struggles, um, and prioritizing the urban struggles. But that's where they had the most members, situated, and that's where the capitalists were being affected more at that point in time. So it kind of reminds me of that. In terms of the federal workers, this is so tricky, and this is why I think we have to treat the whole thing as a process, as a long run process, because at the moment federal workers are not going to be converted to socialism, because because they're so accustomed to the way things have been. But as things get worse, they might change their minds. Some of them might change their minds at some point, and there will be people with inside info and skill sets that we need,
Yeah.
um, at a
It's like with
particular
the
point.
military, obviously, we want the military to be on our side eventually.
Yeah, we don't really want to fight the military, or the
No.
bulk of it. um, and one of my proposals is that we do compensate the last capitalists as well, because that has always happened with the end of any mode of production. The old masters have been compensated to sort of limit the social conflict, limit the sacrifice of any civil conflict, and to essentially conquer a peace at the end of the day. Britain only just finished paying off its former slave owners a few years ago. And of course, that was like, it's terrible that we did that. But at the same time, if we hadn't done it, there would have been a lot more sacrifice by slaves and their supporters when we abolished slavery. So you kind of do have to try and, as painful and terrible as it is, you do have to kind of try and look at it in that context. And the same with the end of feudalism. Feudal lords would return from wars broke, and they would have to sell their land to the peasants, and then the peasants would develop capitalist agriculture. So unfortunately, again, like there's no sort of utopian pure transition that we could really be happy with. And I think in the age of nuclear weapons, I think compensation for capitalists is going to be a really important proposal, because even if you look at something like neuroscience, that's popular now and has really sort of been investigated to a much higher degree with new technology like brain scanning technology, we now know that habits are very difficult. Like we've always known that habits are difficult to change, but we now know that almost all behavior is habitual because it's sort of developed and become accustomed to the environment. So capitalist characteristic, the character of capitalists has been conditioned by the environment that they've grown up in. So if you want to make this transition as sort of peaceful as possible and limit the possibility of World War III or whatever, which I actually genuinely believe Donald Trump wants to do. Like, I don't think he wants to live through nuclear Armageddon. Like, even he's smart enough to know he's not going to survive that. So, we have to make it as easy as possible, essentially, is what I'm saying. Like, if you want anyone to change their habit in any situation, in any application, you have to try and make it as easy as possible. So it's all very well and good sort of fetishizing the class struggle and like putting all your eggs in that basket, but it's also a social struggle. It's not only a class struggle, it's a social struggle as well. It's a human struggle. We're all human, and we would all lose in a nuclear war. And unfortunately, because of the way capitalism works, it's intensifying competition between capitalists, and that is generating wars on their own. Like the communists don't have to exist for that to happen. It's happening because of capitalism and because of the competition between capitalists. So yeah, I'm afraid, like as sort of difficult as it is to sort of face up to the all of this, this is where I'm coming from. Like, this is where I'm coming from, and this is why I talk about everyone getting rich from socialism, like not just workers. I want everyone to prosper, and yeah, there are going to be people that we can never ever win over, like because they're too accustomed to the old world, and it's too hard for them to accept that it's dying out. But we have to have proposals in place, and we have to consider the whole process that is unfolding in front of us, and work out our tactics for now, but our strategy for the long run, and how our tactics will change because of the developments that arise during that time period. So it's very, very difficult. But yeah, we going back to the question, prioritize transport workers and workers who have who are closest to the means of production, absolutely. um, but try and win over, where possible, the layers that have been privileged in the past, that might be sort of downwardly mobile in the long run, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, how I kind of look at it is that if half of the Starbucks in the United States were to go on strike, not really much, like people just wouldn't be able to get their
Yeah,
morning coffee before they go to work. Whereas if half the truckers went on strike in the country, everything would just grind to a halt.
yeah.
Like the whole economy would be held captive by these
Mm.
workers. And if we're talking about class struggle, which one is more effective? People not getting their morning coffee or the entire economy freezing? Uh, the answer to me seems really obvious,
Yeah.
and I find it really interesting that leftists the past few decades have prioritized workers with as little power as they have
Yeah, I
um,
mean,
with
part of the problem is
services.
that it depends on which workers are going on strike and that sort of thing. So that if transport workers haven't been going on strike, it's difficult to relate and agitate to them, I suppose. But when they do, like, yeah, as you say, it has to become the priority.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, this has been an amazing and very enlightening conversation. I'm so glad that you came, and I honestly have many more questions for you that I laid out in my initial outline. So You're welcome back anytime if you'd like to come back and talk
Happy to,
more.
yeah, of course.
Yeah, great. But just for now, can you tell our audience where they can find your work and whether or not you have any upcoming projects?
So, in terms of upcoming stuff, I've sort of turned to a YouTube channel lately. So, I'm trying to get a video out like twice a month. It's quite it's really time consuming doing videos.
Hmm.
That's like all of my stuff. You can find me at Grossmanite. So, it's at Grossmanite on YouTube, on Twitter or X, and my Patreon as well. And um, I'm not. I might be writing another book. I'm not sure yet, but yeah, all of my self-published work is available for free for people who can't afford to purchase a physical copy. Obviously, purchasing a physical copy does support me. It's very time-consuming what I do, and I
Hmm.
appreciate any support. But for people who can't afford to buy my books in paperback, they are available as free PDFs if you go to my link tree, which is again Grossmanite is the username there. So
Nice.
yeah, you can find all my stuff via the Grossmanite handle.
Awesome. I'm going to link all that below so people can easily access it. And again, thank you so much for coming and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much for having me.